Hi there, Dr. Coates. This is Tuesday the 19th of March, and this is the first of two lectures on ekphrasis, a term which I'll explain in just a bit. Two announcements. I'm slowly getting caught up on the Module 4 reading schedule after having posted the exam. By the way, don't forget, if you haven't done the exam, it's due tonight by the end of the day. I hope everything is going well with that. If you've taken it already, I hope that you found it I guess I won't say easier, but more expected. I suppose some of you were caught unawares by what was going to be required of you on the first exam, but since the second one was exactly like the first, I'm still guessing that it was a little bit easier because you knew what to prepare for and what would be expected of you. So hopefully that's true. If not, then you should use the journal assignment that's also due tonight, reflecting on the last unit in terms of what you learned, but you can also talk about the exam and your experiences with I guess the first two exams, and I'll look at that and know better what to do moving forward. Anyway, I hope to have that Module 4 reading schedule all the way completed by this afternoon. I'm going to talk to a few people to see if they have any ideas about how I can fill out that last week, because I have 6 or 7 poems, but I usually go for around 8 or 9, and so I need 2 more. Anyway, as of noon today, Tuesday, I've got the first 2 weeks all linked and uploaded to Blackboard. So if you needed to, you could already start on those. It's just that third week. But I do need to have all 3 of the weeks completed before I can send out the instructions to the people who are going to be doing the fake poets assignment in week 3 of this module. As you know, I like to alert people. Or to remind people about the fact that they are signed up for this particular module for the Fake Poets activity in week 1, and to give them the poems that aren't being illustrated to choose from. So I'll get that out as soon as I can. By the way, in case you don't know, the ones who are doing the Fake Poets assignment this time are Quinn, Taylor, Shaylor, Kylie, Sarah, and Dusko. So, having said that, that means I have room for 1 to 2 more volunteers for this module if you would like to do this for extra credit. Last time I sent out a call for volunteers on email, which I think rewarded those people who spent a lot of time on email. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but this time I guess I'm doing it within the lecture to reward people who read the lecture right away, read or watch it right away when they get it, or whatever. Anyway, it's just another way of doing a first come, first served. If you'd like to be an extra fake poet, please let me know, and I will give you extra credit. Also, I wanted to point out that the illustration wiki assignment for this module is going to be slightly different than the previous modules where I gave you a poem and you illustrated it. This time I'm going to be giving you the painting or a picture of the work that the and a particular ekphrastic poem is based on, and having the groups puzzle out the best way to talk about the relationship between the image and the poem. So instead of you finding images, I'm going to give you an image and a poem, and then have you, talk about its relationship. So I thought it would be something that would be a nice change from what we've been doing in the past, using it, nearly exactly the same skills that you've been developing as you were illustrating the poems earlier. So don't fear that. It's still going to be due at the end of the second week, so you've got exactly the same amount of time. But that wiki has not yet been created, so I'll go ahead and put that up as soon as I have Module 4's reading schedule done, as I was saying. Okay, back to the lecture. This week in Module 4, we're studying poems that make explicit reference to the visual arts. Usually only 1 work of art per poem, although the references themselves are profound and sustained throughout the text. There are exceptions to this, of course. W.B. Yeats has a poem called The Municipal Gallery Revisited, which is basically a poem in which the persona, who's very much like Yeats, is strolling through an art gallery in which he sees pictures of his friends hanging on the wall, and so each stanza is a different picture, right? But usually, there are boundaries placed around the meditation on the visual artwork, and when you've switched one for the other. The strict term for this is called ekphrasis, this description of the visual arts within poetry, and it's either spelled E-C-P-H-R-A-S-I-S or E-K, and that's the spelling that I tend to use because it's the one it's based on the original Greek spelling, which has the K. If you want to use an adjective to describe this sort of poem, it is ekphrastic. So ekphrasis and ekphrastic as an adjective. Ekphrastic poems set up an expectation that the reader should either have already seen or would be willing to look up the picture in question, whether it's a painting or a photograph, because there is going to be this one-to-one correspondence between phrases in the poem and then the details in the visual artwork. So it's it's a description. I'm looking at this painting and I'm seeing certain things in it. And if you're not looking at the painting or sculpture or what have you, then you're not going to really understand what's going on. Indeed, if you look up the etymology of ekphrasis in a dictionary or online, you'll see that it's actually defined as description in Greek. There's nothing really that says ekphrasis is going to be about the visual arts, so I need to explain the history of this. It's only by convention that we associate ekphrastic poems exclusively with the visual arts. In epic poetry, in famous epic poems of yore, include Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, Virgil's the Aeneid, Dante's Paradise Lost, or the Divine Comedy is for all three of them. Milton's Milton's Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, which is the Divine Comedy. Sorry about that. Anyway, those are famous epics of old. In epic poetry, non-visual ekphrasis is much more common than in the lyric. We call these epithets. And actually, the typical one is called the Homeric Epithet because Homer is the one who popularized these. These are descriptive passages in which the action of the epic is paused so that the poet can elaborate, often at great length, on a person's or an object's history. The Homeric Epithet is the prototype of this sort of dilation, where time is stopped. And if you've read the Iliad about the sack of ancient Troy, you're probably already nodding your head absent-mindedly as you recall the long catalogue of Achaean ships in Book 2 of the Iliad, or the many shorter descriptions of the Mycenaean characters. Many-minded Odysseus, for example, is a good epithet. And partly that's due to the fact that ancient Greek epics were written in dactylic hexameter, with 12 beats per line. There's just a lot to go on there, and sometimes you had to fill up the line. And so one good way of doing that was with these epithets. Anytime Odysseus came up, you had this ready-made stock description that you could bring out, because he was clever. He had many minds. They all had a different one, I should say. Anyway, another way of thinking about this, I suppose, is that for thousands of years, the Homer's work, not thousands, excuse me, for many, many, many years, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey were memorized from one performer to the next, and it was only much later, long after Homer had died, if he truly was one person to begin with, that these things were written down. So it was also a memorization tactic. If you knew that you were going to be performing this, then you actually had the ability to jumble the things around, and if you found yourself getting near the line, you couldn't remember what was coming, then you could always bring out that epithet and round it off, usually in a rhyming way. Anyway, so there's both the really long dilations where time is stopped to give you some descriptive passage, and also the epithet, which just reminds you why this person is noteworthy, or who this character actually is, just in case because there are a lot of characters in the Iliad, and they're all fighting with Troy, or either for or against. And so sometimes those epithets were really helpful in helping you sort through who everybody was. Anyway, having those long dilations is partly how the transition in lyric poetry from any old description to visual description began. Some of the more famous of Homer's epithets had to do with weapons and armor of the Greek fighters. Someone cocks a bow, for example, right? And then the narrating voice pauses and says, "Now you may be wondering where this bow came from," how it came to be in Ajax's possession, and then goes on for a few hundred lines about how Ajax had to wrestle with Thetis' nephew's pet goat or something with his teeth. Or I'm making that up, of course, but the gist is sort of the same. You've got, at least in the mind of the reader or the listener, the bow has been cocked for all those lines, and Ajax is probably, all a tremble, wondering when am I going to get to let this arrow go. So I suppose the contemporary analog to this is if you've seen the three Matrix movies by the Wachowski brothers, or siblings now. There's all those scenes where Trinity or Neo jump, and then they're just suspended in midair while the cameras do a 360, and that's kind of like one of these descriptive passages, these ekphrastic passages. Is an odd way in which, even though it's a suspension of time, there's still this sort of marvelous lingering tension that animates that description. So I would not call it boring. I would just call it, a really interesting narrative technique that allows, some more of the, a lot of information. I guess you could call it a flashback if you wanted to as well. There are various ways in which novels and film narratives do the same thing that Homer invented for the epic thousands of years ago. Anyway, I've given you Alexander Pope's translation of the Iliad for the best known of the Homeric Ekphrastic passages, which is a dilation on the shield of Achilles, which is itself a work of art. So it's not just he has this awesome shield, and that's a reason why he's such a good warrior, but it's also because the shield itself has its own history, having been made by Hephaestus, and it's a work of art. Big men need really fancy shields, apparently, and that's a lesson that we can draw from the Iliad. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about the general theory and the consequences of ekphrasis. Thursday I'll go into a few more specific... today I'm talking about the general theory of ekphrasis. Thursday I'll be going into a few specific consequences of its use and interpretive problems to look out for. So that's what's coming. The first thing that I need to stipulate today is that ekphrastic poetry does not need to be representing a fictive painting. It can be a photograph, for example, if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily just paintings about, say, mythological characters. It could also be a painting of a real person, like a portrait. In fact, I'm going to forget the name of the poet, but there's a fairly famous ekphrastic poem about a painting that Charles I painted of his son. I think by Donne. I'm sorry. I'll have to check into that and get back to you in the next lecture. I shouldn't even have said anything about it at this point because I didn't know it offhand. But it could also be a photograph. And indeed, two of this week's poems do deal with real photographs that we can find, and I have found them, and we'll place them, on the wiki for you. However, to count in this category of ekphrastic poems, you need to be able to find the artwork yourself. So, although Adrienne Rich's Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, a poem that we read in Module 2, I believe, is a poem about a tapestry, that tapestry doesn't really exist in the real world. It's just a made-up tapestry, and so that's not an ekphrastic poem. That's a self-reflexive poem about art in general, rather than a poem about any particular tapestry that I could see. Right? On the other hand, Elizabeth Bishop, who wrote Large Bad Picture, which is one of the poems for this week, published that poem and for many years did not reveal that it was actually about a particular painting instead of just all bad paintings. Right? So, you can put yourself in the mindset of her first readers who had no idea that they were reading a poem about a landscape by George Hutchinson, which is definitely going to be one of the ones that I place on the Module 4 illustration wiki. So her first readers must have wondered exactly what it was that she was critiquing or criticizing. So, like the take-home message for this first point is that the work of art being described exists outside the ekphrastic poem, and it's independent. Okay, so this is more of a meeting of two equal works of art, if you will, rather than the poem inventing the visual artwork in order to criticize it. The second thing to remember about ekphrasis is that it's an extremely old tradition, going all the way back, many thousands of years ago into ancient Greece, I suppose. So it will either operate under the assumption of mimesis, the idea that art reflects reality, that's really all it can do, or it will at least deal with that assumption of mimesis explicitly. Mimesis is something that I talked about in either Module 1 or very early in Module 2 when we were talking about the new criticism. So if that is an unfamiliar term for you, I would suggest you go back and look it up in one of those earlier lectures. But if you remember it well enough, it shouldn't be a controversial statement for you to accept that ekphrasis is always kind of inherently mimetic. Because it's also true that ekphrastic art, in describing something that exists outside the poem's textual plane of reference, is already deeply responsive, right? All it can do really is react to a work of art which had to predate the poem itself. Like you're writing a poem to record some observations about what it was like to look at a certain painting or something like that. So really the visual artwork exists before the poem, and there's a way you're only ever going to be able to react or respond to that painting or sculpture or what have you. Hopefully that makes sense. This is not to say that an ekphrastic poem can't be ironic or critical of the visual artwork that it's in dialogue with, but it does mean that the poem loses some essential part of its meaning if you do not look at it alongside its subject matter, or if you try to deny that the visual artwork has some connection to the poem. It does, and it has to. So I think it's kind of churlish to try to act like it doesn't. So although in some cases I've been telling you, try to place boundaries around your reading of the text so that your own emotions don't obscure things, or so that you don't try to rely overly heavily on what you figure the author must have been thinking. But in this case, with this sort of poem, as with, say, an occasional poem, which was very explicitly written for some sort of famous occasion, like the christening of a boat or something like that, I mean, that's a really good reason to read the poem alongside, in that case, the historical event, and in this case, the painting. So there's a way in which, even though I've just said the work of art that's being described you have to stipulate that it exists outside the poem, it also, in a weird way, also exists within the poem because the poem appropriates it. In order for it to make sense, that painting is kind of a part of that poem now, in a way that doesn't exist the other way around. In other words, the poem does not exist within the painting. You might be thinking about the poem when you see the painting, but that's you. But you got to think about the painting when you read the poem, or it doesn't work. The third thing to keep in mind, and this is where I'm going to leave off for today, is that ekphrastic poems that are lyrics, and everything from this week, except for Pope's translation, is a lyric, still keep the perspective of the lyric speaker expressing a moment's mood. So from the reader's perspective, there is a direct comparison being made between the poem on the one hand and the visual artwork on the other. But from the perspective of the speaker of the poem, the persona that is constructed within the text, which is importantly distinct from the author of the text, is only looking at the visual artwork and responding to it in a human way. They don't know that they're within a poem, except by that process of self-reflexivity that we've been talking about. But that's more of a knowing wink to the reader than it is something that you can say that the speaker is conscious of. So by prompting you to think very carefully about the relationships between visual and poetic art, I can't let you forget that these are also textual subjectivities who are pouring their hearts out to you, and it would be wrong to leave them hanging there without attending to them. It would just be wrong. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Those are like 3 things to be thinking about as you think about what exactly it means to have an ekphrastic poem. And I promise you that the poem that I'll choose to talk about this week, I will also tweet out the picture that it's based on, so that you have that basis too. So you can probably expect at least 2 tweets from me and an email reminding you to go to Twitter. One with a picture, one with a question about the poem. Other than that, though, if you haven't taken it yet, best of luck on that exam, and I will see you on Thursday.